You're listening to Inside iOS Dev, show about real-world iOS development. Today with you, your hosts Alex Bush
and Andrew Rohn.
And we have a guest in the studio. Hey, Alex, say hi.
Hi, guys.
Well, I don't know if you heard it.
Live studio audience.
We have live studio audience. And today we're talking about auto layouts, overview, tips, tricks.
Yep. I've been working with auto layout lately, and I wanted to share a bit of this knowledge with you guys, and actually for myself for future reference, because I have not done some UI work lately at Reddit. I've been doing some other stuff, and I had to do some auto layout stuff. And I remember back in the Wanilo days, we were doing some heavy auto layout stuff because there was a lot of UI changes, and I learned like so much about auto layout. And then I was kind of disappointed about. I mean, knowledge was still with me, but I was disappointed at how much I forgot some details. I just had to refresh. So this is the episode for me and the listeners of the tips, tricks, and overview of auto layout. And I learned some new stuff too.
Good. Yeah.
Cool. I guess we'll start with definitions. What is auto layout? Why do we care? Why is it useful?
That thing everyone keeps talking about.
Yeah. And I don't want this to be too beginner, by the way. I'm not going to completely start from scratch about auto layout. This overview that I'm about to give is just to give some context. So this isn't super newbie. This is a little more like moderate to advanced, I hope. But yeah, so auto layout though is like basically in the old days there was not a lot of different screen sizes. There was just the one iPhone screen size, and then we started introducing the iPad and different screen sizes. And so we used frames and we used absolute values, and things were expressed in a coordinate system using absolute values for width, height, and an origin, a point in this coordinate system. But that starts falling apart when you have different sizes because you need something more dynamic, right? So a button should change width or height depending on the screen size or the screen orientation.
Right.
Yeah. And so this is Apple's answer to that is auto layout. And this is kind of the description I wrote, the definition of auto layout that I wrote. Some pedant will probably correct me, but I think this is how I describe it to myself. It's basically a declarative way of describing how your view should lay out in terms of relative position rather than absolute values. And why? So we have adaptive user interfaces. So I think the key thing here is declarative and relative positioning. So with auto layout, you say, I want this to be the left or the leading to be aligned to this view you put some constant offset by like 20 points or something like that. And then the trailing or the right, you say, I want it to be off by this. Offset by 20 points, and then same with the top or bottom. You can also set the width or height in auto layout as well, and it just makes it more dynamic because now, especially if you set like the leading and trailing, let's say to 20 points offset, and leading and trailing, by the way, is kind of similar to left and right. I'll get into that later, though. If you say, okay, I want this leading and trailing to be equal to the leading and trailing on my super view, offset by 20 points. Now on any screen size, the button will be, or whatever UI view, will be offset to the width of that screen, offset by 20 points, whether it's on an iPad, an iPhone Plus, an iPhone X, or whatever other screen size. So it helps solve that problem. I kind of want to go over a little bit of the history of how UI views used to be set before, because I know you worked with manual frames.
Yep.
I actually came into the iOS world just as auto layout was introduced, so I never really had to mess with manual frames. Although at Reddit we do some manual frame stuff, so I've had to learn it. But I feel like knowing manual frames will help you understand auto layout more. And the reason why is because ultimately, at the end of the day, everything ends up as frames. And like I said earlier, basically, I think the key to know is that you're working in a 2D coordinate space, and for you to lay out any UI element in a 2D coordinate space, you always need to ask yourself, does it know where the position is? And that is the X and the Y. That's the origin, the X and the Y. And then the second thing is, does it know its width and its height? And that's the width and the height, like how big that thing's going to be. And that was, in manual frames, that was very explicit. You would just say, I want the X to be this and the Y to be this. You just literally put in these absolute values, 10, 15, width is 30, height is I don't know, 15, whatever, for a button.
There are drawbacks to that, though, right? When your numbers become magical, when you need to adapt to different sizes.
Yeah, which I described before, but yes. But so that's how it was before, and I think actually me writing a little bit of frames at Reddit has helped me kind of understand auto layout more, actually. So I recommend, if you've never written manual frame stuff, maybe try it out and see how it works. You can also, by the way, mix manual frames and auto layout, and I think having an understanding of both helps you have just a better understanding of how things work more generally, and makes you better at auto layout. Anyways, so yeah, like I was saying, there's also this leading thing called like a leading and trailing. The reason why it's leading and trailing is because you have, if you want to support right to left languages like Arabic, then that will flip. They're kind of their right is like it's like right to left on the language. So generally, I think you want to use leading and trailing. And I remember watching a talk actually in one of the Apple devs at WWDC saying like generally use leading and trailing, and he said use left and right. Like basically he said like you'll know when to use left and right if you need to, but in general just prefer to use leading and trailing. So that's what I default to. I guess the other thing I want to say is generally I write. Well, at Reddit and at Wanila, when we work together, we write UI and code. We don't use storyboard.
Yep.
Me and you actually both prefer code.
We do.
Yeah, I find storyboards hard to work with, and they have their problems. And I don't know, like every major application
it's not
that I know, like I know that they use.
It's not scalable.
They don't use storyboards.
Yeah, it's when your team size grows, you just can't go with storyboards anymore.
Yeah, and maybe there's people, and I know there's people who really like storyboards and they can provide a better argument for why to use storyboards, but I don't know. In general, we don't like them. So if you're looking for a reason to use storyboards, you came to the wrong place.
Sorry.
Anyways, so all the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is pretty much making your layout in code. By the way, it's programmatic. But it's better. You'll have a better understanding if you write things programmatically, even if you do decide to later do things in storyboard. So another thing that helped that I thought was, this is kind of like an insight that I had recently in trying to understand the layout system in iOS, is when you set frames manually, and you want to update your frames, you have this method called layout subviews. And in the layout subviews method, you can update your frames to whatever you want. You can change them. This is in the pre-auto layout world. And this layout subviews method is called during a layout pass. And this layout pass is like basically the system will periodically call this method to call these layout subviews methods to like kind of relay out the views. And the thing with that is we don't know exactly when it's called. It's kind of a black box. If you want to trigger a layout pass, you can call set needs layout on the view, and basically that will set a flag on that view that says, I'm sure there's a flag internally that says like
something
the property like layout needed, it's a bool or something, is layout needed. But you merely call set needs layout on the view, and then right after that you can call layout if needed. And that will immediately trigger a layout pass. Another thing to know about that is basically layout subviews will not be called if the set needs layout or the needs layout flag is basically false. So if that's not set, layout subviews will not be called, because it would just be a waste to relay out things if your views positions have not changed. And that's actually why, instead of calling layout subviews directly, you called the layout if needed method, right? Because it would just be a waste to relay out things if nothing actually changed. This is interesting. So set needs layout is set to true automatically in these cases when you add or remove constraints, when you modify existing constraints, or you add or remove a view from the view hierarchy. So this is useful to know. If you do any of those three things, you don't actually need to call the set needs layout property. And then you can just wait. You can just make those changes and wait for the next layout pass to happen. Or if, like, for whatever reason you need to be called immediately. Like I said, you just call layout if needed, and that will happen immediately. So that was like pre-auto layout world. You would set the frames, and then you had this layout subviews method, and that would happen. Now what happens is when you create constraints, what happens is you can think of it as an extra step in the layout subviews that happens before layout subviews. I don't think that's exactly how it happens, but if you just think of that way conceptually, think your frames basically. So you're creating these constraints where just like a set, which will create like these set of linear equations that will be solved and resolved into actual frames at some point, right? Think of it as that step where those constraints are solved using some math that I don't know exactly how it works, Cassari, something like that, formula, I don't know, something like that. That will happen in layout subviews just before, and those frames will be ready so that when layout subviews actually is called, those values for the frame, which is the origin, the x and y, and the width and height, will already be computed, and then those now layout subviews will do its thing and lay out the views just like I described before. So that's how auto layout fits into it. That was really useful for me. I guess it seems simple maybe if you already know that, but for me, just having that understanding was really useful.
No, yeah, it's good to know how things are done under the hood, right?
So yeah, and let me illustrate how this is a really good example, I think, of how that understanding can help you write code that doesn't break. If you're doing animations, for example, you might set up the view in auto layout constraints, and you set those constraints, and then you animate the view by changing its frame. Maybe it's changing its center or something like that to make the view slide to the right 50 pixels. So it'll slide, it'll go there, and then you'll see the view works fine, and then all of a sudden, randomly or seemingly randomly, the view pops back to its original position. So what exactly happened? Think about what I've been talking about. Layouts, basically what happened was you moved the view by animating the frames directly, but the constraints never changed. So the next time the layout pass is happening, just before layout subviews, those constraints haven't been changed. The frames are being recalculated. The constraints are exactly the same, which means the frames are going to be computed exactly the same, which means your view is going to pop right back into place before that animation started. And I see on Stack Overflow a lot of people asking why, my animation's broken when I do this. And if you understand basically the things that I've been describing today, you'll understand why. The constraints weren't updated to match how you change the frames. And really what you should have done is change the constraint and then animate the constraint change. So I think that kind of understanding will help. What else? I wrote some notes here. Okay, there's this update constraints method in there in the UI view. Update constraints is this method where you can hook in basically constraint updates. And Apple recommends in their docs, actually, if you need to change a constraint, they say keep a reference to that constraint. So for example, let's say you have a button and you tap it and then a constraint will change based off that button tap. Apple recommends you just keep a reference to that one constraint and then you just update it. And I think the reason for that is just code readability. It makes it simpler. You can just follow the code. You have your did tap button or whatever, that method that's called when they tap on the button. So did tap button is called. And then in there you see self.myConstraint.constant -50 or something like that. Then it's clear in readability, as soon as I tap the button, the constraint has changed. But the thing with that is that can be slow if you change a lot of constraints there. So if you want to be faster, you can use this update constraints method, which batches the constraint updates. But, I guess Apple recommends not to do that. As far as I can tell, it's just code readability. But if you need performance, update constraints is where you do that. And another gotcha that's important to know is it's kind of weird because you're supposed to call super in update constraints. And most methods you call the super call at the top of the method. This one you actually have to call at the bottom, which is weird. I think it's the only one that I know of.
Right. Yeah.
Personally that I've seen. Another thing is that, there's this flag called on your UI views called translate auto resizing mask into constraints. If you're creating your views in code, that is automatically set to true. You need to set that to false if you're setting constraints on that view. If the frames are set manually, you can leave it alone and leave it as true. If you don't set it to false, what will happen is the system will automatically create constraints for you on that view. And then basically now you have your constraints that you created, and then the system created constraints, and then they're going to conflict, and then it won't work basically because the constraints will not be able to resolve because the formula is essentially broken. So that's one gotcha to pay attention to. Another one is if the translate auto resizing mask into constraints is true, don't add any external constraints to that view because the view's size and position is already determined by its frame. So, anyways, I think that's kind of an overview. What'd you think?
No, that's a great. I actually learned myself.
That was action packed.
things.
I felt like that was fire hose. Something came over me. I like auto layout, but it's been a while since I did it, and so I had to kind of relearn some things. But I felt like I learned even more this time, especially with the manual framework that I did at Reddit. I had more knowledge in terms of how things are actually like. It's just frames actually at the end. This auto layout thing is just an extra step. Just think of it as an extra step before layout subviews. That like probably for me was the biggest insight.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, guys, go get your auto layouts and frames straight. Don't break anything. And we'll see you next time.
Next time, follow us on Twitter at InsideIOSDev, and then email us at hello@insideiosdev.com. Buy Alex's book. What is it?
iOS Interview Guide.
Where do we find it?
iOSinterviewguide.com.
Man,
will help you get that next dream job.
it got me the job at Reddit, man. I love it there.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
And yeah, guys, take care.
Take care. Bye.